Good evening. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending tonight's session. I just want to start off with a little bit of a disclaimer. First of all, I'm Kelly Mahoney, and I'll be your facilitator this evening. Just a bit of a disclaimer. We are this is presented by the League of Women Voters of Naperville. We do not support or oppose House Bill 3653. Today, we're presenting a wonderful discussion with Representative Ann Stava Marie. And this is about an opportunity to become more aware and educated on what this bill is and how it impacts our cities across the state. So we previously had an opportunity to interview our City of Naperville Police Chief, Robert Marshall, which was a widely attended event, but if you missed it, please check it out. It's posted on YouTube. And tonight we will also be recording this session. And so you can also check that out. We will be posting it on our social media channel. So delighted to have you, Representative Ann Stava Marie. Thank you so much for taking a little bit of time out of your busy schedule. I'll just start with a brief introduction of you. You are our representative for the 81st District, which includes portions of Downers Grove, Lisle, Naperville, Woodridge, Darien, and Westmont, along with Bolingbrook. You've served in your role since 2019, and prior to that, served as part of the Naperville Board of Fire and Police. You're married, you have 3 kids, and I assume you probably live in the area.
I do. I actually bought the house I grew up in Naperville.
Oh,
Southeast Naperville.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. We are so delighted to have you, mainly because you had a lot to do with this bill. I'll say you were the sponsor of really making this bill come to life. So to have an opportunity to speak with you about what this means is quite an honor. And I guess we just wanted to start with that. Could you maybe just share for our members that are joining us, what was your role in this bill and the production of this bill?
Yeah, I'm honored to have been able to not only vote for this bill, but to have been closely listening to my colleagues, particularly from the Black Caucus, who led the creation of this bill. And just to give you an idea, there were 4 Black Caucus pillars that came out after the death of George Floyd and subsequent to the largest civil rights movement that we've had in US history ever. So that all took place last summer, and that kicked off the ball for the Black Caucus pillars to start being created. And those pillars were in the area of economic reform and economic equity and growth, also in education. This was criminal justice reform. And then, of course, because this is being recorded, I'm going to forget the 4th pillar off the top of my head. But it suffice it to say, it was a comprehensive platform to really look at how we can become less racist as a society, or as I like to think of it, more anti-racist as a society. And so when this bill was created, it actually it's an omnibus bill. So it's a bill that has 700 pages to it. And what an omnibus bill means is that it's a compilation of many other sub-bills that are within it. And so a lot of the bills that are actually contained within the act, this is not the first time that they've been seen. They've been introduced in prior General Assemblies. People have been very slowly chipping away at these issues for many, many years now. And so we were looking at I think the Black Caucus assembled all of the bills that were generally in this criminal justice reform area, which of course is much broader than just the policing reform. The police are one aspect of it, but it also includes things like eliminating cash bail, which is a system that we know disproportionately harms people who have less resources available to them. And can cause things like people to lose their job. And these are people that are innocent until proven guilty and may be falsely accused. So it's really important. We did a lot of really important things, but it was exciting because we actually had many different subject matter hearings on the topic. I'm a member of the Jude Crim Committee in the House. So that's the Judiciary Criminal Committee, which is the committee that this bill went through. And the Jude Crim Committee had joint hearings with the Senate so House and Senate. And I think we had over 12 different subject matter hearings on the content of this bill. And each of those subject matter hearings had anywhere from 3 to 10 experts testifying to all of the members. The members of the House were able to ask questions of the experts, which included law enforcement experts, states attorneys, all sorts of nonprofit organizations who have done a lot of research in these areas, and professors, just lots of really people better versed in this than me or even some of the other legislators were resources to us as this bill was being built. And so that process was the course of many, many months of work. Why didn't we vote on this bill sooner? Well, we as a General Assembly only met for 5 days in 2020 because of the pandemic. So I think we had like 5 days in Springfield, and we were doing most of the stuff remotely, and we were only allowed to pass things that were directly related to the pandemic or the budget. So we were not able to pass anything that had anything to do with policing reform. And as we recall, that was also before the death of George Floyd and the spark of the latest round of our civil rights movement. So we ended up having, normally we would have done it in veto session, but veto session was canceled for November, again, because of the pandemic and timing concerns. And so in order for the body to meet as few times as possible, we put a lame duck session that was on the very tail end of the 101st General Assembly that dovetailed with the beginning of the 102nd General Assembly. So that way members were really only going down to Springfield unvaccinated one time because we didn't have access to the vaccine at that point. And so the timing of it was such that it was literally just the thing that made the most sense to do. And so we were packing in as many bills as we could into that short period of time. Again, having had those subject matter hearings ahead of time, having vetted and thoroughly looked at many of the different aspects of this legislation, and also hearing feedback from law enforcement, from different parts of the community, from people who were in the know and cared about this legislation. And so, and in fact, law enforcement and negotiation, things that they were negotiating for and wanted, there were negotiations up until the very minute that it passed. And so why did we wait until the 11th hour to pass it? Because there were negotiations ongoing, and we were giving a lot of bandwidth for those negotiations. So, and when we got to the House floor, I can't tell you what a truly historic moment the passing of this bill was. It literally gives me goosebumps remembering the moment, because so many of my colleagues put their heart and soul into this, and policing reform has been a passion of mine for many years now. And I think we all have, I mean, many of us have seen the need for it, the need to weed out bad apples that are making deadly mistakes. And in some instances, sadly, not mistakes, but are resulting in the death of people. So when we were on the floor, my colleague, who was the lead sponsor of this bill, literally started crying the moment that this passed, because I think he didn't necessarily, I think he was overwhelmed with being able to pass a bill of this magnitude that really centers the experience of Black Americans and centers their safety in a way that really hasn't been contemplated by our law as a state up until this point. And so I think it was a really, really powerful historic moment when we were able to pass this bill. And God bless Stephanie Kifowit, because she was the 60th vote, and it passed with the absolute bare minimum votes that it needed to get through. And I think that it speaks to the power of what can happen when communities come together and push for change, just like an incredible amount of change and just raising standards. And I'm sure you talked to Chief Marshall, and you know a lot of the stuff that we included in the bill, Naperville Police Department's already on top of doing, and have been for a little bit. But I think there are obviously many police departments across Illinois and other aspects of the bill that are super important as well. So I'll pause for a moment.
The passion is definitely clear, and the hearing your story and the fact that, because this bill is commonly sort of referred to as the policing reform bill. Stepping back just a minute, what does it mean to be a sponsor of the bill?
A co-sponsor of the bill?
Yes.
So that means a co-sponsor of the bill means that not only am I voting yes for this, but it really means like this is wholehearted, full throttle support for the bill. That this progress that we're making is one that I would like my name attached to for the history books. And so, and that I believe my district would want us to be associated with for the history books and moving us forward.
That's so helpful. Just wanted, and then when you talked a little bit about this as you were kind of walking through the process, and you called it an omnibus bill, which means it contains lots of different components all in one, some of which, you know, have been talked about in the past. So to create a 700+ page bill and do it as quickly as you did, that's not quite fair, right? This has been in the works for many years. Can you talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah, so the way that bills are introduced, typically our legislative season is from January until May, and we have deadlines after January every year to get our bills in. And so a lot of the bills within it, so I can give an example so I'm not so let's say deaths in custody. So through this criminal justice reform bill, when there is a death in custody of law enforcement, we will be having many more questions that they have to answer. It requires a law enforcement agency to investigate and report the death of an individual who dies while in custody of the agency in a much more robust manner than they have been asked to in the past. And this is a bill that was originally sponsored by Representative Camille Lilly. And I remember hearing it in 2019, and I don't even think that was the first time necessarily that she had presented that bill. So it was a bill that had already been heard by the Judiciary Criminal Committee. It was one that we were familiar with. And a lot of the different aspects of smaller pieces. There was another bill, for example, prison gerrymandering, saying that people who are currently incarcerated should be counted for the purposes of their House representative districts and state representative districts should be counted within their home district, because if they're counted within the population of where our prisons are disproportionately within Southern Illinois, which are disproportionately white areas. And so in order to better comply with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, this is an important step that we took. Another example of a bill that had been there before would be that people have the right, once they're taken into custody, to have their call to someone within an hour, take place within an hour. We know that there are of being taken into custody. We know that there have been many instances where people have been questioned for hours without access to their phone or ability to call an attorney due to that is our fundamental rights as Americans, having those rights withheld. So this is something that definitely takes and enhances people's rights.
And then the new parts of the bill, what would you say some of the more recent adds to the bill would include?
So I think the newer pieces, some of them were stuff that came specifically from like the George Floyd incident. So like the newer pieces in terms of like the way that we define use of force and how we limit use of force, I would say some of that language was informed by recent events. There was another piece of the bill where that has to do with no-knock warrants and how they can be used. And we severely limited how no-knock warrants can be used. And that again was in response to public events that occurred in nationwide news. So I would say those were the pieces that were the newest, were the things that were directly applicable to the cases that we've seen happen across the US.
And then adding that all together, obviously culminating into a giant omnibus bill. When was this introduced into the House?
So we had information on the segments. So throughout those 12 subject matter hearings, those happened last fall. So they started in like August, but the actual bill was introduced in January.
And then relatively quickly, it became approved. And so can you walk us through that timeline? So January, and how long did it take for it to be passed?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it depends on what you call relatively quickly, because we always have budgets drop and we have to vote on them in an hour of them dropping. So this was actually like, we had a lot of time. I had plenty of time to read the 700 pages that were the prior version to the final amendment that dropped. So we had several days to be able to digest the final bill language, or we had several days to digest the language, 95% of which was the final bill. What happened between the amendment versions, that the amendment that was actually passed versus the prior amendment, the changes, any of the changes that were made were at the request of the law enforcement community. So the last minute changes, honestly, that people were feeling up in arms about were things like taking out the end of qualified immunity, which is actually something that I do support doing in terms of ending qualified immunity. But that's become a completely separate topic, which we put in a task force for, but there's also a standalone bill. I don't think it has the support to pass this year, but we shall see. Anything is possible, really. But that takes away very quickly on that piece. The qualified immunity is not a statute in our state law. It was something that was created by judicial review. And so it's something that says that it's okay for law enforcement officers to basically take away people's civil rights and their rights that are upheld by the Constitution. And so the repeal of that's on the table currently, which I am supportive of, says that no longer could qualified immunity be used as a defense, but it has to, in order for an officer to be really held accountable with this, they have to have had the intent to deprive someone of their constitutional rights. And so the bar is very high in terms of what that means. And it's definitely bad apple behavior. That is what we're talking about here. So that's why I happen to support that, which I think is part of the sort of next steps of the bill. But sorry, I think I strayed from your initial question there.
No, totally fine. This is about learning. So I think this is great. I think what I was doing is just sort of putting together a timeline just to alleviate any questions or educate questions around how did this bill get passed and what seems to be by the general population kind of quickly. I think you're talking about many elements of this bill had been brought up for several years. There were some newer adds to this bill for sure, in light of just the recent, George Floyd and other social injustices that have been happening at the hands of, police officers. So I was just kind of getting a sense for that. And then where I was really going is a couple of questions around the testimony, these panel discussions that you talked about. When does that come into this process? And then you spoke about experts and nonprofit organizations, but specifically around the experts, can you speak to what that means? Who is it that testified in this bill?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't have the list of people, of everyone that spoke off the top of my head available, but I do know that, like, for example, there was a professor from the University of Illinois at Chicago who was an expert in the field of policing, and he had some data, or he might have been there for cash bail. I'm not going to remember exactly, but because these were, again, so the 12 subject matter hearings, about, I think 9 or 10 happened in the fall. So they were they were happening bi-weekly from August 2020 to November 2020 would be my guess, in my recollection. And for instance, and I commend Chief Marshall, who, when we were talking about this, when he was talking about this topic at a city council meeting that talked about the subject, he said the police actually did have a voice in the subject matter hearing process, or the police chiefs. So there's like the Illinois Association of Police Chiefs.
Yeah.
So the representative from there was speaking to it. We also had other retired chiefs come and speak to the bill and speak and give expert testimony. We had LETSB, the Illinois State Standards and Training Board, there for at least one of our subject matter hearings, and they're the ones who set the statewide standards for how officers are trained, and they give basically, they testified that they only give like a rubric to our different state agencies. So we didn't have a universal definition of use of force in the state of Illinois prior to this bill. And that was actually something that the chiefs of police asked us for, to define on a statewide basis, because there was nothing for a Let's Be, because we didn't mandate a unified definition. There could be one different definition in Pekin, Illinois, and another definition in Springfield, and yet another in Naperville. So it was really important that we bring everyone up to a higher standard, and a high standard that luckily I think was already being met in our community, but making sure that everyone rises to that standard.
The Chief Marshall did talk about that. He talked about his involvement in that council, which is great. Although I will say, he also mentioned there are elements of the bill that are a bit, problematic or need to still be worked out as we kind of transition to this new state. Can you comment on, are there any areas that you feel are a bit problematic as we kind of transition into implementation?
Yeah, I think there was one aspect of the bill that, quite honestly, there was disagreement between the House and the Senate on the interpretation of what was the content of the bill. But essentially it was whether or not officers would be allowed to just review their body cam footage on a regular basis. So we required body cams as a part of this legislation. For anyone who's unfamiliar with that aspect of it, we're requiring body cams. There's a rolling basis of when those can be, when cities or municipalities are required to have them based on the size of the municipality. So the smaller the municipality, the further out in the 5-year schedule they are. But a lot of agencies that already use body cams, if someone's out doing a day's work, they'll reference that body cam footage in the reporting. And this bill created a hiccup in that process in such that, and so I think that's something that could be negotiated or worked out. I think the intent was that if an officer is in an officer-involved incident, that they don't then have access to footage, was the intent that I was told of the bill, which I think makes a lot of sense, because in no other instance, if someone is committing a crime, are we like, hey, here, have the footage, and have at it to make up whatever excuses you want about what the story is other than what actually happened. So I think that's where that was the intent. And I think it went a little further than what I would want in particular. So, and no bill is ever perfect. We are always coming back and having trailer bills and fixing language and clarifying pieces. I think there's been a lot of pushback about a pretrial release. But one of the aspects of pretrial release that's really important that I'd like to highlight is that domestic violence groups were actually in support of our bill, because it makes it harder for someone to be released if they are a threat to a specific identifiable person or persons. And so it's actually our cash bail system is less safe, because if someone can just afford to get out, they can post bail, even if they are a threat to someone personally. And for instance, the guy who was the senator who was the lead sponsor in the Senate of this bill, LG Sims, was targeted by someone in a car wielding a gun with this last month when we were in Springfield, and waving and like trying to get him to pull over and like threatening him. And that person was arrested, but then released on bond within 24 hours. And so that was not a situation that resulted in safety for the victim. And so I think really this pretrial detainment system that's based more on risk of harming someone rather than whether or not someone can afford a small, like $200 bond that maybe they just can't afford. And they get stuck in the system and they're much more likely to reoffend there. So I think that was really transformative and a
win. So you're actually saying more of a win in the sense that not problematic, more of a win, but definitely controversial. So yeah, and maybe we could talk about that just for a little bit. I mean, I was going to ask, what do you think are the positives, but hang tight on that. I think we will, but sticking with cash bond, because I think there's just clarification on what does this mean and a little bit more about what the intent is. The positive intent would be really helpful, but maybe starting with what does this mean?
Yeah. So in the United States, we have always said that we don't want to have a debtor's prison, that we don't want to just be locking people up because they can't afford to pay a fine or they can't afford a lawyer or something like that. That's why we have public defenders. That's why we have a jury of peers who hear cases. So in order to better fully realize that vision of what we really strive for, we saw cash bail as a real impediment to justice and delivering justice, because it was basing the decisions of whether or not people are detained, having their freedom removed from them based on how much money that they had, as opposed to necessarily, I mean, there's some level of the bond is set at whatever based on the crime, and the judge has some judgment in that, but it's not, the judge doesn't determine how many resources the person has access to. And so we saw just way too often people who were getting caught up in our system and actually reoffending. There's a study that shows that, especially for like the misdemeanor offenses and lower level offenses, people are much more likely to recidivate, which means to commit additional crimes, if they are detained on a long basis. So I think that was fairly clear and convincing in terms of the need to remove this system. And a lot of other states have tried to do it. A lot have failed. I think one of the strengths of this bill approach that we took was that we have a 3-year transition process. So everyone else was trying to get it done right away or within the year, but we recognize that this is going to be a long ongoing process and conversation in implementation. And so that's why it's designed to be a 3-year implementation process.
And that's a good point I wanted to kind of highlight here. We will be the first state to eliminate cash bond by 2023. Is that a fact?
Well, New Jersey tried to and basically failed. And I think California has at times tried to and not succeeded. And so I think if we could become the most successful state at implementing an elimination of cash bond. And the sad reality is that a lot of our systems do rely on that money and as like a profit generation to run our criminal justice system, which is just not an actually just way to run it. So figuring out how things are paid for will be one of the challenges that comes out of this bill.
Right. And to that point, back on kind of the problematic elements of it, and you mentioned this a little bit, that no bill is ever perfect. And so there's always this process where we need to go and do some clarifications. We call that a trailer bill. Is that correct?
Correct. Yep.
Is there a current trailer bill that's already underway for this particular bill?
You know, I haven't talked to Representative Slaughter on if he has a specific trailer bill on any of the language, but I do know that he was very open to working with law enforcement and anyone else who wanted to clarify or offer amendments or offer language. that didn't change the substance of the bill or the intent of the bill, but clarified things for people. So I think that's where it was at. And I don't know if they actually did submit their language to him yet or not.
And is this where some of the experts and other members can really weigh in on? So I know when Chief Marshall was speaking to us, he was really talking about this trailer bill and some of the aspects that he was eager to help ensure there was clarification on. So how do, and do you know, how do trailer bills get developed? And is this an opportunity for some of these experts in the police, in the criminal justice system? Can they weigh in on it?
Yeah, absolutely. And the way they get developed is typically the chief sponsor of the bill will continue to have discussions with those who are interested in reforming certain aspects. And honestly, there could be an area of the bill that was, or an area of the law that passed that I could offer a bill for next year. That could be, it doesn't have to be an official trailer bill. Like, not only the chief sponsor is allowed to do a trailer bill. A lot of times there's different people can introduce. So, and I don't know if they would do another omnibus or not with those changes on touching that aspect of the bill. Typically, we're careful to not change, especially to not change the intent of certain areas. But I'm happy to try and facilitate that process as much as possible.
That's great. We have a question back on cash bail real quick, just to ensure understanding there. If there isn't, so this is the question, with a no cash bail policy, is it truly no cash bail? Is there ever an instance where we may have to require some form of cash bail? So just testing that, is it truly absolutely no cash bail?
Yeah, that's what the goal is, yes.
And
so
then
pretrial detainment no longer, whether or not someone is detained pretrial, should no longer be about how much money is in their bank account, but how much of a risk they pose to society. So that's the major groundbreaking change.
And then who is responsible for that pretrial detainment? Is that the judge?
So I believe it would be the entities. There's a judge, yes. So there's basically, for certain crimes, there's just no pretrial detainment. And for other crimes where there might be someone who is at risk, they have to go before a judge who will determine whether or not they're detained pretrial.
Was there any discussion about incentives to bring, if there is no cash bail, what incentive does a defendant have to come back?
Yeah, so we actually there's data that shows that it's not really an incentive to come back, that in systems where there is or isn't cash bail, whether or not there's bail, it's not necessarily an incentive for people to show back up. And in fact, it can be a deterrent, because if someone loses their job and then they have a new job, like that they had to get, if they don't have time off, whatever, like things can happen and people just don't show up. But the more that we can allow people consistency in their life and continuing forward, the more likely they are to actually follow what they're supposed to be doing and not reoffend and really stay closer to the letter of the law.
Benefits outweigh the cost. Is that what I'm hearing?
Definitely, yeah.
That's great. On the body cam video footage, that was something we did talk a lot about with Chief Marshall when he was here. A couple areas. One is just the cost of outfitting and equipping all of the police departments. This is definitely not necessarily an issue for the city of Naperville, but for the state, the cost associated with equipping everybody with the right equipment. Can you shed any light on your thoughts as it relates to that? Where's the funding coming from?
Well, I think what we have to think about when we think about state mandates, which this was, is what's the cost if we don't do it? What's the cost if we continue to allow police officers to behave however they'd like because they have no recording of their behavior? And the cost that we've seen to society of that approach is quite high. And so I understand, I know one of my colleagues who's a Democrat didn't vote for it because the small towns will have a hard time paying for some of the maintenance fees of the data and cloud. But I think one of the things that we see is that technology advances. So as we're moving forward, as we get closer to the date that those smaller towns have to, I would imagine that the actual storage fees lessen, like any technology, over time. But beyond that, I think that there was an element, and don't quote me on this because I could be inaccurate here, but I believe that there was some bill that addressed funding for smaller municipalities potentially. And then additionally, there are some federal funds that are expected to be put into this area to help purchase equipment. So I think there were a couple of different funding areas, and we understand and we wish that police officers would all just do their jobs without having any bad apples, but that's not a reality. And we find that having the cameras really does enhance public safety. So.
And clarify for us the date. So the date by which body cams are mandated is when?
Okay, so it's a rolling basis. So the first ones will be, it was within like the first year. And then year two, it is based on municipality size. So I don't remember that off the top of my head, but I think it was something like for municipalities over $1 million, it had to be the first year. Between 500,000 and $1 million was the next year. Between like 200,000 and 500,000 was year three. I think we were in like year 3, 4, or 5 in Naperville, which it sounds like we'll already have been outfitted with them well before that time. So there's definitely enough time for everyone to get on board. And for me, I know we try to think about every area of the state, but I'm there as the representative of the 81st district. Mm-hmm. And in the 81st district, none of my municipalities came to me saying that they couldn't afford this. Mm-hmm. It was a priority for each of them and an important priority to many of the constituents who live in my districts and my districts.
Helpful. And any concerns about so one of the things that Chief Marshall was talking about, is it that the bill requires body cam footage to be processed like immediately? He was talking about, obviously not a police officer, but he was just talking about some of the challenges associated with having the body cam on at all times or processing it. And I don't want to speak for him, but
yeah, I think there was something that had to do with saying that limiting the amount of footage that they might have to release.
Right.
Because to like a couple of people, because if it's all the same angles of the same situation, like blurring out people's faces can be a time-consuming task. I think really there aren't a ton of FOIA requests, quite frankly. And if we ask Chief Marshall how many FOIA requests for footage they've had, it's mainly journalists that are requesting footage. And I've actually done a FOIA request of the Naperville Police Department myself back when I was just a community member. And the FOIA requests, they have to be within the realm of reason. So if someone's FOIA requesting too much data, that's already accounted for. So I think that I'm not saying that it's not a concern, because it definitely sounds like it's a concern for him. But I would say that not every piece of footage is going to be publicly available. So they don't have to worry about preparing every file for public viewing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just the FOIA pieces.
Right. Thank you for clarifying that. So overall, just the bill in general, it's got, if you had to kind of summarize the 3 elements of it, I have some thoughts, but the 3 elements of it, you've talked about it's statewide standards for use of force. Even Chief Marshall talked about some great things around enhanced training. Mm-hmm. And expansion of training for police officers, which, by the way, the city of Naperville, he said, we're already doing. So that's really wonderful, but not across the state, and that's for sure. Greater oversight for officer misconduct, and some of these newer things around cash bail. What am I missing when I summarize it based on what I heard?
Well, I think you actually touched on something that I had missed before, which was the greater standards for officer misconduct. So we actually have implemented now a database. So when we were trying to hire for the city of Naperville, for example, let's say someone had been discharged from another community for discharging their weapon in an unlawful use of force. Currently, if they weren't delicensed, which almost no Illinois officers were delicensed in the past, or not licensed, but what's the term that they use? We just said it.
About a police officer, I said the greater oversight for officer misconduct.
Yeah, so the misconduct database. So when they have the misconduct, they can be put onto, basically we'll be able to tell now if someone has had misconduct that rises to the level of them no longer being certified. Certification is the word I was searching for, sorry about that. Because I know we originally were calling it licensing, but there was a lot of pushback from the law enforcement community that they did not want it to be called licensing. They wanted it to be called certification, and that was not the hill to die on over this bill. So that portion of the bill was actually negotiated between the Attorney General, Kwame Raoul, and law enforcement partners over the course of last summer as well. And that portion of the bill almost, I think there was no opposition to. So that was the misconduct pieces. There's also a duty to render aid that requires all law enforcement officers to render medical aid and assistance consistent with training and request emergency medical assistance if necessary. We have the right to communicate with family that I had mentioned before. Use of force and execution of a search warrant. So this was the very limiting the no-knock warrants and the way that those can be used, the end of cash bail. And then there were also aspects that helped for officer wellness. So I believe there was a part at the very end of it that was on officer wellness or having to do with that as well.
One of the things,
very large bill.
yeah, absolutely. And that's why I kind of wanted to just summarize for everybody. It is a large bill, just sort of summarize at the highest level what this involves. One of the conversations I know we've had as a league is, you know, mental illness. And this actually came up in one of our conversations about this bill, mental illness being kind of a leading cause to why there are altercations even among our with our police officers and our, you know, and civilians. And so any discussion about greater funding for help with mental illness to prevent situations like this as part of this bill development?
Mm-hmm. Can you tell me a little bit more about like the mental, like the victims having mental health crises?
Yeah, the civilians. Yeah, so that was just something that I know Chief Marshall had talked about, is just a focus on helping when to spot there may be some mental illness that's causing people to maybe act out in ways that might end up causing an officer to use some element of force. This is how that entered into that conversation. Yeah,
and I think that is a critical thing that wasn't necessarily covered by this bill, but is something that's incredibly important, is making sure that officers understand how an autistic person behaves, for example, because they may not be following commands, and it's not because they are defiant, it's because they might have longer auditory processing times. They might have become overwhelmed and overstimulated and shut down and become nonverbal when they're placed in a position of stress. So these are all things that we don't mandate that our officers go to training on, unfortunately, on understanding the neurodiversity of our world. But I think definitely those aspects could make a lot of people safer. And it's definitely something that I'm willing to look at and explore further.
So all in all, I mean, are you feeling like, and can you speak to this, I should say, that this bill puts our community in a safer position? And if so, can you explain why?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was called the Safety Act. So, but I think it absolutely does. And you know, I tell this story a lot of times for why I got involved in policing in the first place, but I had friends visiting from out of town who happened to be in my car, and my grandma broke her hip. They were in town. Everyone, my family and friends were all in town for my, I think, daughter's baptism or something like that. And I was like, oh, my parents didn't have Tylenol. So I ran with my two friends to the grocery store, and I was like, do you guys want to sit in my car while I run inside? I know you've been traveling all day, or do you want to come with me? And they laughed and they said, I don't want to be a Black person sitting in your car in suburbia, and like, no thanks, we'll be coming in with you. And I didn't know whether or not that fear was unfounded or not in our community. And there have been instances of racial profiling that have happened in probably every community that I serve at some point in time. And so I think that definitely was just a light shining that, like, it's our friends and family, and it's not just people visiting from out of town, it's our friends and family that live here, who are people of color, who don't feel safe currently with the system that we have. And so I think if we are serious about our commitment to safety, that means safety for every resident. And I think this definitely moves the ball forward on that.
And that's from the perspective of anybody that comes into contact with a police officer, fair?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And how about somebody that hasn't, or that isn't? This is just, you know, general population. Like, there's a bit of concern. There's been some conversation specifically with cash bond. Does this mean we now have more people that have committed crimes walking the streets? And so, you know, how safe are we going to be now with this change? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the things that, if a person, again, or a person or persons are going to be threatened by someone, then they will be detained. So I think in the case of, that's why the domestic violence groups were on board with this bill. I believe it makes people safer to have a system that's based on how severe, how harmful someone's behavior is likely to be to someone else than the current cash bail system. So I do truly believe that it will make every person safer. And for those that have, and for those that are not posing a threat and have sort of misdemeanor activities, or it might be like a simple drug possession or whatever it is, a lot of times those aren't necessarily victim crimes. So when we're talking about crimes with victims, those are the ones where they'll be assessed for whether or not they're a threat.
And then speaking, the other element to this is really just we'll say, I don't want to use the word limiting an officer's ability to enforce any sort, but yeah, I mean, I think there's a bit of a concern now as a police officer, can I be, you know, a police officer protecting our community in the same way that I once was, and keep our community as safe?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's been a lot of fear-mongering tactics. I'm going to be quite blunt. Yeah. A lot of fear-mongering tactics by law enforcement who didn't want any change at all in their profession, who wanted to continue doing things the way they've always done them. And I had a very clear mandate from people in my district that they didn't want business as usual from the police. That this business as usual attitude is what has gotten us to the place where we have the largest civil rights movement in all of US history. And so clearly we don't want to have George Floyd in our area. We don't want it in the state of Illinois. We don't want it in the state of Illinois at all. We had Laquan McDonald lose his life at the hands of an officer whose family I spoke with this past year. And I'm actually looking at doing a bill for him as well, with his family, looking at aspects of the law that they want strengthened, that they still think that there's more that we can do. So the fear mongering, like, oh, if someone comes on your porch and then we can't remove them and they're going to just keep coming back, that is fear mongering at its ugliest, I would say. And
that's what we're asking. So thank you. I would like to give you just a moment to just reflect on this conversation. And is there anything that we didn't cover and you'd really like to talk to our members about as it relates to the work you're doing specific to this bill, police reform, or something else even. I'd just like to give you a few minutes to chat.
I'd just like to thank every single person that showed up and had a voice and spoke out and said the status quo is not okay, that our status quo as a state, we need to have a higher standard. Because I think that really is what made it possible for myself, for Senator Ellman, for others in the area to be able to be supportive of this. So I'm very grateful for our community and for the standards of which we'd like to see in our police, but also in our criminal justice system, being a fairer system, being a safer system for every person in the state of Illinois.
Thank you. There may be some of our constituents that may have questions or may want to reach out, especially as it relates to trailer bills or other reform. So what would be your recommendations on how can they reach out to you, or how do they go about doing that?
So constituents, whoever your state rep is, reach out to your state rep, please. So if you're not my constituent, if you are in Rep Yang Roar's district, reach out to her. We have large amount of constituents. So we have 110,000, approximately 110,000 per district. And we actually had population growth in DuPage County. So some of our districts have more than that. So the best place to contact my office is to call Kim at 630-605-0595, or you can email Kim at office@repstavamarie, all one word, .com, no hyphen, office@repstavamarie.com. And the number for Kim again was 630-605-0595. And as a follow-up, I just wanted to put a little plug in. I forgot to mention this a second ago. But I'm going to be having an event in a couple of weeks, I think 2 weeks from today, in fact, that is featuring Carlton Myers, who is someone who authored part of the bill and will be helping to implement different aspects of the bill, particularly in the area where we have now a greater community input in training standards. So he's going to be doing a great job of that. And so we're going to be, so if you're my constituent and want to take part in that Zoom, just call my office and you can get signed up through there.
Perfect. I want to say thank you so much for spending this time. Your passion for police reform is so clear. Your dedication to building what is, a first ever in our state and probably, the nation in a lot of cases is really a testament to all the hard work that you put into this. And so we just appreciate you very much, and the fact that you spent an hour with us educating us on this lengthy bill, which there have been, just a lot of misconceptions even and misunderstandings about. So this is why we do this. And I just want to say thank you on behalf of League of Women Voters for your time. And
well, thank you for organizing this, because it makes my life easier, because I'm always trying to shout from the rooftops, wait, you want to learn about this? So it's awesome. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. We will close. We have just one announcement for our league. So if we could do a quick screen share. Thank you. So we have, and we thought this was very relevant, we have a criminal justice reform town hall. And if you want to learn more, and I think this is April 29th and it's from 7 to 8:30. So register today. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great rest of your evening, and feel free to check this out. There will be a recording posted on our YouTube channels. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thanks.